It's week 3 of Advanced Composition, English 311, and you've just completed your invention for our first composition. For those of you who volunteered to provide the rest of the class with a draft of your first composition, a rough draft for spotlighting, thank you for doing so. You should have already received some feedback from me. For the rest of you, you probably want to start thinking this week about the work that you're going to do for Composition 1, start some drafting of that. And this slideshow is really going to help give some global comments to you that should apply to everyone. It's based on my thoughts about the assignment itself, the way I put it together, and also those first invention exercises that I read, kind of, how did you handle that and what might you need to think about, all of you, as you transition from doing that invention to really focusing in on Composition 1. So I'm just going to do 5 really quick tips here, review these that might guide that thinking as you move into actually drafting Composition 1. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is I want to make sure that you identify a really specific audience. You need to think, okay, I have my issue in mind that I'm exploring. Who needs to be educated about the issue? Or if you are focusing on expanding a perspective, broadening a perspective, you might want to focus on who needs to know more. Who needs to be aware of an additional position or a perspective that you feel hasn't been fully explored yet. Okay, and as you think about this audience, you want to ask yourself, why is this an important audience to address right now? This relates to the term exigence. Exigence is the reason that a rhetorical action has to happen right now. It's the sense of urgency we feel about addressing something at this moment. So you should have some sense of why the audience you have chosen needs to get an education right now, or needs to learn about a new perspective to expand their full understanding of the issue. Okay? As you identify your audience, you want to stay away from really broad groups, Alaskans or Americans or people who oppose the war, and be much more specific. Try to be as specific as possible. You should be able to imagine the audience that you're writing to. You should be able to envision them. They should be people that you can call up in your mind. So your roommate, Chancellor Case, first-time Anchorage voters, even though that's a little bit harder to put a face on, but that's pretty specific. Anyway, that you're not going to be too specific with this choice of audience. Most times students are way too vague, and we'll practice this throughout the semester. A really specific audience allows us to make smart and informed rhetorical choices. Okay, you also need to know your purpose, and I gave you 2 on your assignment sheet. The first one is to provide a thorough but a basic introductory explanation of various sides of an issue. Option 2 is if your audience already knows something about the issue, you're still going to give that overview, but you're going to probably emphasize a particular perspective or maybe several perspectives that you feel might be underexplored or overlooked by that target audience. Okay, so really your purpose is going to should fit into one of these 2 categories. Okay, tip number 3 is that you need to really focus on explaining in this document and not persuading. Yes, you're dealing with an issue. Yes, it's a debated issue. It's an unresolved issue. But right now, you need to exercise restraint. You're not making a persuasive pitch. You're not trying to get someone to think a certain way or do a certain way. Your goal is to educate your audience. You want to do that ethically and thoughtfully. You don't want to just skim the surface. You kind of want to give this some thought and give it some depth. And you also want to make sure you're not leaving out an important part of the conversation. That's where the ethical part comes in. But really, you need to respect the fact that your audience is in an information gathering phase. You're just giving them information. You're not trying to persuade them one way or another, at least overtly. I mean, we can say that anything can be somewhat persuasive, but really the takeaway from this assignment is that it should be educational for your audience to read whatever you put together. So if you're writing and you're working with a kind of main idea that looks something like this in relation to your own issue, my issue that I'm working on for this example is online education. So if I write something like online degrees should be valued as much as those granted by brick and mortar institutions, well, this word right here, should, that's a clear giveaway that I'm trying to convince my audience of something. So if you're seeing something that resembles this type of kind of working thesis statement, slow down, back up. You need to rephrase it to be more educational and less persuasive. So what might that look like? Well, here is one example of how I might provide a working thesis statement for an exploration to a very general audience. They don't really know much about this topic yet. More and more students are completing their higher education online, but a debate about the value of an online degree continues to spark conversation among academics, students, administrators, politicians, and employers. That would be my working thesis for whatever I'm writing, kind of my controlling idea. Okay, two things to note here. I'm only going to make this claim, more and more students are completing their higher education online, if I know that that's the case. It's really easy to make assumptions just because you become aware of something, that it's a new idea or it's a new conversation or that it's happening more than it did before. So in whatever I write, I want to make sure that I'm backing that up. More importantly, though, is look at how this working sort of thesis or controlling idea kind of gives the reader a little bit of a hint of what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to talk about how there's a sort of a perspective among academics. There might be more than one, but I'm going to talk about those stakeholders in this issue. Students kind of represent another group, administrators, politicians, and employers. So you can see how I'm really going to talk about what I've learned about this issue, kind of generally going over what some of the main perspectives are from these different groups. So the other option, if you have someone who already knows about the issue but you want to shed more light on the issue for them, you could do something like this. And here we might think of this final draft as being in the form of a letter to Chancellor Case. More and more students are completing their higher education online, but there is no consensus about the value of an online degree. Many advocates support online education based on its ability to make learning accessible to a broad range of students. Detractors tend to contrast the online classroom with the face-to-face classroom. I am writing to you to encourage you to consider the perspective of UAA transfer students who have a unique relationship to online learning. Now, I'm probably going to talk in this letter about advocates and break that down a little bit. Not all advocates support online education for exactly the same reason, so I'd probably talk about different perspectives related to this term accessibility. I would also kind of gently map out or briefly map out some of the views of people who tend to say online education and online degrees are all washed up, they're a bad idea, but this purpose is really to educate Chancellor Case about a different perspective, and you're really just giving him information. So this is a good example for that second purpose. I have a really specific audience. I'm bringing in a unique perspective and expanding Chancellor Case's perspective on this issue. Okay, almost done. Tip 4, you want to break free from that tug-of-war mentality. Issues always have more than two sides. You know, they might not have a whole range of sides, but you know, we talk about things as being black or white, either or, but really when you dig and think about an issue, usually there are more perspectives than just two. So this assignment pushes you to really think about that and get out of that tug-of-war framing, us, them, X or Y, okay? Make sure that you're not accidentally slipping into this way of talking about your issues so that they're kind of the bad guys on one side and the good guys on the other. If you're rereading what you're writing and thinking about your composition as it's taking shape for you, and you're realizing that it's kind of sounding like bad guys and good guys, or you get some feedback in that direction, you want to think about really expanding your thinking so that you're showing that there are a range of ways that you can look at the issue, and you're not really casting judgment. That's not what we're doing in this assignment. Instead, you want to think about how your composition, whatever form it takes, a letter, an essay, whatever, it's kind of painting a landscape of the issue as it exists right now. Or maybe you can think of it as depicting various schools of thought. And here it might be really helpful for you to look online at this New York Times page called Room for Debate, and I'll let you explore this on your own. But Room for Debate, it's a series, it's a blog that has a series of issues. Should students live on campus or off? And when you look at an issue, you kind of get a little blurb about what is the most general approach to the issue, but then there are a series of perspectives from different people. There are never just two. It's always at least 5, 6, 7 people who say, well, from my perspective, based on my experience or my interest, here's how I would weigh in on that debate. So that's a really good way to help you start thinking about taking a landscape view or a schools of thought view versus an us or them view. Okay, this is the last tip. Let your invention work for you. Okay, so you're mapping out your schools of thought, but I've also been asking you to think a little bit about these underlying assumptions or networks of interpretation. Kind of what are the perspectives or beliefs or values that are kind of bubbling up underneath the actual discussion of the issue. And you might be wondering if networks of interpretation should be showing up in your composition. Well, no, I don't want you to write one paragraph on networks of interpretation. I want you to think about this in a more nuanced way. As you're thinking about your reading, you're getting a sense of how people are talking about your issue, the approach that they're taking, you can start to do a little critical thinking about why you think people hold those opinions. This is kind of what we've been talking about in class and has been discussed in your reading about their networks of interpretation or their ideologies and how that informs their position. So you're not going to advocate that one position is better than the other, but you might be able to shed some light for your reader on why these positions are being held. And this is not something that I think has to look the same way in every final composition. This is just your opportunity to put some of your critical thinking into play in an important way, in an enlightening way, to educate your reader. So what might this look like? Well, here's an example. So as I'm working on my online education issues composition, I'll pretend, I might start really thinking about what I've been reading as kind of the position that a lot of politicians take versus the position that many educators take. Now, I'm having to kind of generalize a bit, but I think I'm being fair. I'm doing some reading and trying to kind of make some helpful generalizations, not problematic generalizations. What I've noticed is that politicians, the more I think about it, through my invention exercises as I've been writing and answering questions, I realize that they really focus on the short term. They focus on short-term needs, economic constraints of state education, funding, etc., and they really seem to respond to measuring student success. And then when I think about what I've been reading about educators' positions, I think, wow, they take a really different approach. Their approach is more long-term. They really think about educating the whole person, not just educating someone for a certain job, but actually educating them for being a good citizen or asking questions. They seem to question assessment as being a measuring learning, which is a really long and slow process and messy process, and assessment wants us to kind of reverse that thinking. And educators seem to talk about how much time it takes to really learn how to teach online well, so that's kind of a long-term interest too. So if you kind of come to this, that aha moment, that's something that you might be able to weave into your final composition that might help educate your reader about something that you realized through the process of doing this reading and thinking about the schools of thought related to your issues.